On the evening of Wednesday, September 24, 2003, 45-year-old Michael Albert Dohaquez laid down flat on his back on his yoga mat in front of a room full of his students at a yoga studio in downtown Tucson, Arizona. The students all followed Michael's lead, laying down for a pose called Shavasana, which signaled the end of a long workout. Michael loved this final pose because it was all about meditation, and it really helped him get centered for his day. And after a few minutes in this pose, when he sat up and told his students to rise as well, he felt both exhausted and recharged. He got to his feet and smiled at his class as everyone else rolled up their yoga mats and got ready to leave. Although Michael was a machinist by trade and spent his workdays in his shop tinkering with tools and small engines, he was actually a very artistic and kind of zen person. He spent his free time giving music lessons on his guitar, and he also taught 15 different yoga classes every week in various gyms and studios all across Tucson. His genuine enthusiasm about the physical, mental, and spiritual benefits of yoga were very infectious, and it put many of his students at ease around him. In fact, they were so comfortable with him that they called him MAD, which was short for his three initials, Michael Albert Dohaquez. Michael toweled the sweat off his face and looked up at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 p.m., and his stomach was beginning to rumble. So he asked the class, as they were getting ready to go, if anybody was feeling up to grabbing some food and a few drinks, which was actually a question they were all expecting, because hanging out socially was something that this Wednesday group typically did each week after their workout. One student immediately shouted out that they would, and a few others raised their hands as well. So Michael suggested they all meet at a bar on 4th Avenue, not far from where the yoga studio was located. The students that were going all nodded their heads in agreement, and then all of them, the ones who were going and the ones who were not, all shuffled through the studio's door and outside to the parking lot. But before Michael shut off the studio lights and followed the group outside, he picked up his cell phone and called his girlfriend, Amber Trudell. He'd been seeing her off and on for about a year after first meeting her through his yoga lessons. Recently, things had been a bit rocky between Amber and Michael, but Michael still wanted to invite her out for dinner and drinks. He figured that by having her be a part of a big group setting out at a public place, that would sort of give them a chance to have fun without the opportunity to argue, since if they argued, it would be in front of everyone, so that was a natural deterrent. After a few rings, Amber answered her phone, and Michael told her very enthusiastically about his plans and said that he would love it if she came out with them. But Amber hesitated, and Michael frankly knew why. In addition to the problems they were having in their relationship, Amber was just a very shy person. She preferred private lessons with Michael rather than being a part of a big group where you had all these other people sort of watching you stretch for an hour. But after a few seconds of awkward silence on the line, Amber said that she actually would meet up with Michael and his students at the bar. Michael was thrilled and told Amber he would see her there. Then he ended the call, shut off the lights in the studio, and walked out the door into the parking lot, thinking about Amber. Michael and Amber were opposites, but that didn't really bother Michael. It also didn't bother him when Amber teased him about how he dressed like a hippie with his long hair and beaded necklace and sandals. Michael could take a joke, and above all, he liked to have fun, which in his mind was what he was doing with an attractive woman like Amber, who was actually 17 years younger than he was. Their relationship really was pretty casual, and Michael intended to keep it that way. He'd been married twice already, and was a father to 3 kids, as well as a grandfather. And at this point in his life, he did not want to be tied down anymore. Amber, on the other hand, she did want to get serious. She kept asking Michael to marry her, and every few weeks, she'd break up with him for saying no. And so Michael knew that their relationship status would likely come up tonight in conversation. But since there were other people going out with them, he figured maybe he could dodge an argument about it. A few minutes later, Michael walked into the bar on 4th Street and found 5 of his students already sitting at a table. He sat down and ordered a drink, and shortly after that, Michael looked up to see Amber walk in through the front door of the bar. He stood up from the table, gave her a big hug, and then invited her to take a spot right next to him. From that point on, the group ordered some food, and they drank and talked and goofed around until around 8:30 at night when folks started getting tired. At that point, they all paid their checks, and then they left. Now, most of the students were heading home at this point, but Michael, Amber, and one of the students, Michael's friend Eli, decided to continue their night and go have a few more drinks at another bar. So the 3 of them went to another establishment until around 10 p.m. And at that point, Eli decided it was time for him to call it a night. He took some cash from his wallet, put it down on the table, and then he headed home, leaving just Michael and Amber at the bar. And now that the couple was all alone, just as Michael expected, they began to fight. And so Michael began drinking faster and ordering more drinks for Amber, hoping that maybe more alcohol for both of them would mellow them out. 2 hours later, at midnight, when the bartender turned the lights off and then back on again and then announced out loud it was last call, both Michael and Amber were pretty drunk. Michael yawned, finished the rest of the drink in his glass, and asked Amber to come back to his house with him. She said she would, and so Michael and Amber paid their tab and then walked out the front door into the night. Shortly afterwards, the two of them stumbled up the walkway and onto the front porch of Michael's house at 2602 North Sparkman Boulevard. Michael unlocked the door, and then he and Amber stepped into the kitchen. A day and a half later, on Friday, September 26th, at around 6:30 in the morning, a woman was walking her dog along North Sparkman Boulevard in Tucson. The street was in a pretty rough neighborhood where there were lots of burglaries and muggings, and so most people kind of kept to themselves when they were passing through. Usually, the woman walked her dog at a fast pace with her head down, avoiding eye contact with other pedestrians and avoiding looking into other people's properties. However, when the woman passed in front of number 2602, something caught her attention. Just beyond some brush obscuring the front patio, she saw a flash of something light-colored that was obviously not vegetation. She turned her head to look and blinked for a second in confusion, because what she was looking at didn't make sense. It was a person's bare legs in shorts splayed out on the patio. Now, the weather had been excruciatingly hot and muggy and stifling for the last few days, including today, so the woman at first thought that maybe this person up on the porch had passed out from the heat. Now, as soon as she thought that, her first instinct was to walk up and investigate and make sure this person was okay. But since this was not really a safe neighborhood, the idea of just strolling up to some stranger's property seemed kind of risky. But just then, she saw another man walking on the street towards his car, and she called out to him and pointed over at the legs on the patio and asked if he would go see what was the matter. The man looked over at the house and saw what the woman was pointing at, sort of looked puzzled for a second. Then he turned back to the woman and gave a thumbs up, like, "Yep, I'll go check it out." Then the man walked over to the porch. The woman watched as the man walked up to the porch, and right as he got close to the legs, he called out the name Michael. And then the man who was doing this checkup, he began backing up, and then he turned and actually started running back towards the woman, and as he passed her, he just said, "I'm calling 911." Not long after that man called 911, Detective Ben Jimenez of the Tucson Police Department drove down North Sparkman Boulevard in his cruiser. He came to a stop just outside of number 2602, put his cruiser in park, and cut the engine. Around him, he saw other squad cars and ambulances doing the same thing. Jimenez stepped out of his air-conditioned cruiser into the hot, muggy morning air. He took off his suit jacket and tossed it onto the driver's seat, and then shut the door. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, loosened his tie, and then walked from the curb up to the porch of the house, until he was standing next to the dead body of a man who was lying face up and wearing yoga pants and a tank top. Jimenez was not the first member of the Tucson PD on the scene, and one of the other officers who was already there told him that the body he was looking at belonged to the home's resident, who was named Michael Dohaquez. The officer told Jimenez that the rest of the property was empty. Michael was their only victim. Jimenez put on a pair of disposable gloves and squatted down next to the body. He could see there was a single bullet wound in the center of Michael's forehead. Around the bullet wound, Jimenez could see a black star-shaped gunpowder burn. There was lots of dried blood on the porch floor around the head, and more blood on Michael's clothes and legs. Jimenez mentioned to the officer to be on the lookout for any shell casings. Then Jimenez put his hand up to Michael's exposed skin and found that it was actually still warm. The fact the body had not gone cold yet suggested that Michael may have been killed only a few hours earlier, probably in the early hours of Friday morning. Jimenez looked at Michael's hands and saw that they were covered in scratches, which told him that Michael very likely must have fought with his attacker. Jimenez stood back up, but just as he was about to walk inside the house, he stopped, because he noticed that some guitar and violin cases were haphazardly stacked up outside on the porch. And this struck him as odd. because nobody in this neighborhood would ever store expensive musical equipment outside, or really anything sort of like obviously expensive outside, because it could get stolen. But regardless, Jimenez stepped through the front door and into the kitchen, and as he did, he saw more music gear. This time it was an amplifier and a guitar stand that had been left to the side of the door just inside the house. On the floor near the gear, Jimenez saw broken glass from a shattered window pane. And so already, Jimenez was beginning to develop a theory. He wondered if maybe Michael had interrupted a robbery. Maybe the thief or thieves had been in the process of shuffling the musical equipment out of the house onto the porch, kind of stacking it up near the door as they were doing it, when Michael came out and confronted them. The broken glass in the kitchen suggested that the fight maybe started there, or at least in part happened right there, and then from there, they moved through the door onto the porch where Michael was ultimately shot. And then when Jimenez did a walkthrough of the rest of the property, he found in Michael's workshop that it was perfectly intact and none of the very obviously expensive tools had been taken or moved. And so to Jimenez, this cemented his theory that very likely Michael had interrupted a robbery. And so very likely, at least according to Jimenez's theory, after the robber shot Michael, he figured that they must have panicked and then just taken off without finishing the job. By this point, the crime scene was swarming with members of the forensics unit and also uniformed officers. Jimenez knew it would take hours to process the scene for blood, fingerprints, and other trace evidence, and also officers were already out knocking on doors in the neighborhood looking for witnesses. So Jimenez decided to leave and go talk to detectives in the burglary division to see if they had any similar cases or usual suspects. Back inside of headquarters, Detective Jimenez walked quickly to the burglary division. He rapped on the open door of one of the offices there and caught the attention of a detective at a desk. Jimenez explained the case he just caught, laid out his theory about a home robbery gone wrong, and then asked the detective if he had any recent robberies on or around North Sparkman Boulevard. And the second Jimenez mentioned North Sparkman Boulevard, he saw this detective's eyes light up. He shot straight up in his chair and very excitedly said that yes, he did in fact have something. Just 5 days earlier, on Sunday, he had arrested two men, Joseph Keyes and David Wynn, for robbing a home in that exact same neighborhood. But that wasn't all. First of all, Keyes and Wynn lived in a house that was just a mile away from Michael's place, and, most importantly, one of the items these two men had stolen was a guitar. Jimenez knew this was a great starting point, so he got Keyes and Wynn's home address from the detective. Then Jimenez returned to his own desk and began filling out an application for a search warrant. While he waited for a judge to approve his request, Jimenez's phone rang. It was one of the officers who'd been knocking on doors over on North Sparkman Boulevard. The officer told Jimenez that nobody in the area heard any gunshots or any unusual noises coming from Michael's house early on Friday morning, and nobody seemed to have seen Michael at all for a day or two. However, one neighbor told police that on Thursday afternoon, Michael must have been working in his workshop because they'd heard his compressor going. So, the neighborhood canvass had not produced a witness to the killing, but they were starting to build a picture of Michael's final hours. Jimenez thanked the officer for the good work and hung up the phone, feeling satisfied. Less than one full day into his investigation, and he already had a very promising working theory, he had a search warrant application out to a judge, and he was refining, his victim's final moments to really get a sense of what actually happened here. But for now, it was late in the evening, and he knew he had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. So he shut down his computer and left his office. The next morning was Saturday, and Detective Jimenez arrived at his office to find that his search warrant application for the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn had been approved. He also found a copy of the autopsy report waiting for him, along with a couple of reports from other detectives who had begun to reach out to Michael's friends and family. Now, Jimenez was very eager to go search Wynn and Keyes' house, but first he picked up the autopsy report, flipped it open, and gave it a quick read. The coroner had found a .38 caliber bullet lodged in Michael's brain. The star-shaped gunpowder burn around the entry wound meant it had been fired at close range, which Jimenez had already guessed. And also the coroner noted that the wounds on Michael's hands were indeed very likely defensive wounds. The most useful part of the report focused on Michael's time of death. When Jimenez got to the scene and he touched Michael's body, it was warm to the touch, and so he had assumed that very likely Michael had died recently. Jimenez just didn't know exactly when. And the coroner was able to confirm that suspicion. Because Michael had not yet gone through rigor mortis, the coroner was able to establish an actual time of death. Michael had been shot somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday morning. And so this information meant that Jimenez could be very specific when he was investigating suspect alibis. This was great news. Jimenez rifled through the other reports, which laid out a rough timeline of Michael's activities before his death. He had taught a yoga class on Wednesday night and gone out for drinks afterwards with some students and a girlfriend who Michael's friends knew only as Amber. Then on Thursday, he'd apparently spent the entire day holed up inside of his studio working. Jimenez put the reports down. He'd have to work on tracking down Amber later, but for now, that was not his priority. Instead, he gathered up a team of officers and drove over to the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn. When they got there, they knocked on the door, they didn't get an answer, and so eventually they forced their way inside, and immediately they discovered that there was nobody home. However, pretty quickly, once Jimenez walked into the kitchen, he knew coming to this house had put him on the right track, because in the kitchen, there was this very random-looking pile of clothes. Jimenez put on his gloves, squatted down, and one by one, he picked up a bandana, a pair of pants, and some shoes. And he saw that every item in this pile was splattered with blood. Jimenez was thinking that at this point, all he would need to do to close his case was get these items over to forensics and match the blood on these to the blood of his victim. But the next morning, when Jimenez walked into his office, he got two pieces of bad news, one right after the next. The first piece of bad news was that the forensics did not match. The blood found on the bandana, the pants, and the shoes was the wrong type. It didn't belong to Michael. And the second piece of bad news was that even though Joseph Keyes and David Wynn appeared to be the perfect suspects on paper for this murder, robbery detectives had found one big problem. When Michael was shot early on Friday morning, Keyes and Wynn were both already sitting inside of a jail cell. And so, just 2 days after Michael's body was found, Detective Jimenez found himself back at square one. Jimenez sat at his desk, flipping through reports from the crime scene, and hoping he'd stumble upon a detail that maybe he missed. And after about an hour of doing that, he did find something. On a list of items found inside of Michael's house, Jimenez saw a cell phone. At this time, in 2003, not everybody had a cell phone yet, so it wasn't something police immediately looked for when they arrived on a crime scene. Also, cell phones at this time did not contain the kind of evidence that they would today. There was no internet access on any of them, and people didn't send a whole bunch of text messages or really use them nearly as much as we do now. So Jimenez got up from his desk and walked to the evidence room to get the cell phone. And once he had it, he went straight to the single most useful piece of information the phone contained, and that was the call log. The detective began scrolling through the list of people Michael had spoken to before he died. And at the top of that list was the phone number for a contact listed as Amber Trudell. Jimenez read the name and immediately felt a jolt of excitement. Michael's friends had said that his girlfriend was named Amber. He had meant to track her down, and now he was staring down at, very likely, her phone number. Jimenez took the cell phone and went back to his desk. There, he used his own phone to dial Amber's phone number, but there was no answer. It just rang and finally went to voicemail, which was very disappointing. So Jimenez left a voicemail and asked Amber to please call him back at her earliest convenience. After he hung up, Jimenez just stared at the call history list again. And as he did, he noticed something curious. Michael had been killed on Friday morning, but his last call, which was to Amber, was made on Wednesday night. It seemed bizarre to Jimenez that there was this weird gap in time leading up to Michael's death. It was hard to imagine that all day Thursday, Michael hadn't spoken to anyone. And as he thought about this, he also found it to be kind of suspicious that Amber had not already come forward to talk to the police, considering that her boyfriend had been murdered. And so Jimenez began dialing numbers from Michael's contact list in his phone, including Michael's ex-wives and his adult kids, asking about Amber, looking for any information he could. But it seemed like no one really had any information about who this person was and what her role was in Michael's life. So, by the time Sunday came to a close, Jimenez had a new hunch about where he should focus his investigation: on his victim's girlfriend, Amber. The next morning, on Monday, when Amber still had not returned Jimenez's phone calls, he tried her again. And this time, his call went straight to voicemail instead of ringing like it had the day before. This meant her phone had shut off. Jimenez wasn't sure what to make of this. It was possible that Amber's cell phone had simply run out of batteries. In 2003, that wasn't that unusual to have your phone die and just sort of go without your phone for a while. Also, people did periodically just turn their phone off and not return calls. It was just a different time. But with every hour that went by that day without getting a call back from Amber, Jimenez couldn't help but get more suspicious. Finally, the next day on Tuesday, Jimenez got a phone call. When he picked it up, he hoped it was going to be Amber. But it wasn't Amber. It was Amber's boss, who Jimenez didn't know and had not called. And Amber's boss, who said she had heard about the murder on TV, had a story that changed everything Jimenez thought he knew about this case. The boss said that Amber worked for her as a bookkeeper at a charity called Child and Family Resources, and Amber was usually very reliable. But on Thursday, so a day before the murder, Amber had called out of work for what she said was a family emergency. She had been supposed to return a day ago, on Monday, but she hadn't shown up. And so Jimenez scribbled all this down, thinking that Amber did seem to make a pretty good suspect after all. But then, Amber's boss said there was one more thing. Amber's relationship with Michael was not a typical boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. It was an affair. Amber was married. Less than an hour later, Detective Jimenez walked into the air-conditioned bagel shop where Amber's boss had said that Amber's husband worked. After he had wrapped up the call with Amber's boss, Jimenez was left with a feeling of whiplash. Until her boss had told him about the husband, he had been viewing Amber as a possible suspect, and a good one. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was some kind of a victim. After all, right now she was still unaccounted for, nobody had heard from her, and this affair certainly gave her husband a very solid motive to potentially harm her, or harm Michael, or both. All Amber's boss had known about Amber's husband was his name, Justin Goodwin, and his place of employment, this bagel shop. However, when Jimenez asked the employee at the counter if Justin Goodwin was working, the employee looked surprised and kind of nervous, and just shook his head and said no. Then he told Jimenez to wait and left the counter to go into an office in the back. And then after a minute, another man walked out to the counter and introduced himself as the manager. And he told Jimenez that he was sorry, but Justin had worked here, but he quit his job very suddenly just the day before. To Jimenez, it was sort of head-spinning how quickly this new theory that Justin could be involved here was picking up steam. So he asked the manager if he knew anything about Justin's wife, Amber. And the manager made a sort of pained expression. He told Jimenez that all he knew was that their relationship seemed very tumultuous. In fact, Justin had once missed work because he'd been arrested for domestic violence. Jimenez could barely contain his eagerness as he asked the manager for Justin's address. Then, after he got it, he left the bagel shop and sped to the home of his new prime suspect. But when Jimenez arrived, the lights were off in the house. The driveway was empty, and nobody answered the door. And so Jimenez walked around to a few of the nearby houses and spoke to the neighbors, sweating in the heat the whole time, but they all said that they hadn't seen Amber or Justin for at least a few days. Disappointed, Jimenez gave them all his card and asked them to call him if they remembered anything or if they saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. For the next 3 days, Jimenez and his team searched for Amber and Justin and put out notifications to neighboring police departments to be on the lookout for them. But he didn't make any progress until Friday, October 3rd, exactly 1 week after the murder, when one of the neighbors whose doors he had knocked on called him back. It was a woman, and she sounded breathless and excited. She told Jimenez that he had to come back to Justin's house right now, because at this very moment, she was standing at her window and watching as Justin and another man were taking all the furniture out of Justin's home and loading it into a rental van. Jimenez immediately ran out of his office, hopped in his cruiser, and he sped over to Justin's house. And when he got there, he saw a man who he instantly recognized from the mugshots as Justin himself. And just like the neighbor had said, Justin clearly was taking furniture from his house and putting it into this van. Jimenez hopped out of his cruiser, quickly identified himself as a detective, and asked Justin what he was doing and where his wife was. Immediately, Justin looked nervous. He told Jimenez he was moving, which certainly wasn't illegal, and as for his wife, he said he had no idea. He said they were getting a divorce, and she was on her own. Then Justin did something that caught Jimenez totally by surprise. It was swelteringly hot outside, and at some point Justin lifted up his shirt to wipe the sweat off his face. And when he did, Jimenez saw tucked in Justin's waistband was a gun. Now, Jimenez had no idea if Justin had a license to carry this gun, but considering the entire circumstances, it was too much to overlook. And he told Justin he had to come down to the station and answer some questions. Once they were at the station, Jimenez led Justin into an interview room. At this point, the red flags around Justin were almost comically conspicuous. He had been arrested for domestic violence in the past, his wife was having an affair, and now she was missing, and her affair partner had been shot to death. Justin had quit his job and cleaned out the house where he and Amber lived, all while armed with a gun. So when Jimenez sat down at the table inside of this interview room, he felt pretty confident that he had his killer right in front of him. Jimenez handed Justin a bottle of water and then began asking him questions, starting with, did he know a man named Michael Dohaquez? Jimenez watched as Justin took the cap off his water and raised it to his mouth before answering, and he saw that Justin's hand was visibly shaking. After a second, Justin just said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. When Jimenez followed up and said that Michael and Amber were having an affair, Justin denied knowing that too. He said that he and Amber clearly were having problems, they were getting a divorce, but those problems had nothing to do with anybody named Michael. He swore again that he really had no idea where Amber was, and insisted that all of the incriminating facts that seemed to surround him were just a coincidence. Right as Jimenez was starting to get frustrated with Justin, feeling like he was blatantly lying to him, there was a knock on the interview room door. Jimenez turned around to see another officer step inside, holding up Justin's cell phone, which they had confiscated along with Justin's gun when they questioned him. The officer apologized for interrupting, but asked Jimenez if he could please step out of the room and speak to him for a moment. Jimenez got up and left the interview room, and the officer handed him Justin's cell phone. He explained that the whole time Jimenez had been questioning Justin, it had been ringing incessantly, and finally he had just picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, and she had hung up as soon as he, the officer, had identified himself as police. However, the officer had traced the phone number and found that it belonged to the Extended Stay America Hotel right there in Tucson. Jimenez could not believe his luck. Whoever that was calling Justin, if he could just catch them before they left that hotel, they might be able to give him some real answers about what Justin had been up to for the past few days. So Jimenez asked the officer to keep an eye on Justin because he was going to go track down this mystery caller. A half an hour later, Jimenez was offering a pleasant but very impatient smile to the employee behind the front desk at the Extended Stay America Hotel. The detective had no way of knowing what room the mystery calls had come from, so the employee was looking it up for him, but it was taking forever. Finally, though, the employee looked up and said he did have a woman staying in the room where the calls came from, and the employee said that woman's name was Amber Trudell. Detective Jimenez would take Amber back to the police station and would spend the next several hours untangling her story and Justin's. The detective's murder case was changing faster than he could even keep up with. First, it had looked like a robbery, and he'd had 2 slam-dunk suspects, but that had fallen apart in days. Then he had Amber Trudell, the suspicious girlfriend, who he thought maybe was dodging his calls because she was guilty, but Amber had turned out to be missing, and a possible victim. That revelation had given him Justin Goodwin, the jealous husband, but just as Jimenez had thought he was closing in on Justin for killing Michael and maybe even Amber too, Amber herself had reappeared, holed up in a hotel, and calling Justin over and over again. Whatever Justin and Amber were relationship-wise, they apparently were not totally broken up yet. And so now Jimenez was considering yet another theory, that maybe Justin and Amber had killed Michael together. He figured he could put them both in separate interview rooms, take each of their statements, and then grill them on the inconsistencies that he was absolutely certain he was going to find. But that didn't happen. To Jimenez's shock, Justin and Amber's stories matched each other perfectly. Yes, they said they were having marital problems, and yes, they saw how suspicious all their behavior looked. Between Justin quitting his job and lying to police about where Amber was, and Amber abandoning her job and ignoring all of Jimenez's calls while hiding in a hotel, But they swore they didn't kill Michael, and they had alibis to prove it. Because on Thursday morning, so almost a full 24 hours before the murder, they had left Tucson, headed 3.5 hours north to a mountain town called Sholo, Arizona, where Justin's mother and stepfather lived. They told Jimenez to call Justin's parents and check for himself. And so Jimenez did just that, not really sure what to expect. He didn't really have high hopes here that they were going to actually be able to confirm their alibi. But it would turn out that Justin's stepfather, he was a retired police detective, and he was very straightforward and specific about the timeline. And even though this kind of poked a hole in his whole case, Jimenez believed him. And so this meant that between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday, when Michael was shot to death, Amber and Justin were almost 200 miles away. And not only that, but Justin's gun, that had been such a red flag, was not the same caliber as the murder weapon. And so Jimenez's best suspects were just more dead ends. Jimenez let Amber and Justin leave the police station, and he went back to his desk, where he slumped in his chair and stared miserably at nothing. By now, it was late in the day, and Jimenez had no new ideas. His case was turning out to be much more complicated than he had initially thought, and now nothing was making any sense. And so he figured, what he really needed to do now was just take the weekend and look at the case with fresh eyes on Monday. There had to be something he was missing, some piece of evidence that he was either misinterpreting or missing altogether. He decided he would make one more phone call and then head home. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed the number for the coroner's office. And like he expected, on a Friday night, nobody picked up. So he left a voicemail asking the coroner to take one more look at all the Michael Dohakwa's evidence. He explained he wasn't totally sure what he was looking for, but something just didn't feel right. And he wanted the coroner to look really closely one more time so that he had sort of a good starting point on Monday. Then Jimenez hung up the phone, picked up his jacket, and headed home. The tip that would break this case wide open came early the following week. But the tip didn't come from the coroner. It was a phone call from someone Detective Jimenez had spoken to already in this investigation, and who he never expected to hear from again. This person said that Jimenez had to come meet with them right now, and Jimenez didn't hesitate, because what this person had to say didn't make sense with the rest of the evidence that the detective had. But the detective no longer trusted all of his evidence. He was sure there was something wrong with his facts, he just wasn't sure what it was, and so maybe this was part of it. Jimenez drove out to meet the person who called him, and the person took him for a walk. They said they wanted to show him a hole that they had found in the dirt. And when Jimenez got to that hole, he stood there panting in the warm air, and he realized that finally, he knew who his murderer was. He just had to figure out how this was possible. And this is where the coroner came in. Because shortly after Jimenez got back to the station, the coroner called to tell Jimenez that he had been right. They had all misinterpreted one very important piece of evidence. The truth had been right in front of them all along. They just hadn't put it together. Based on evidence collected over the course of a few weeks and the revised results of the autopsy, this is what police believe happened to Michael Dohakwa on the morning that he was killed. It was 1:30 in the morning, and Michael had just confronted his killer in the messy kitchen of his home. The killer was enraged, and the two of them were standing near the sink, shouting at each other. At some point, the killer grabbed a glass and threw it at Michael, but Michael managed to dodge it, and the glass hit a window pane near the front door, shattering glass all over the ground. Michael was about to step towards the killer to stop them from throwing anything else at him, but there was something he didn't realize. The killer was hiding a revolver. And suddenly the killer drew their weapon, and when Michael saw it, he rushed forward to try to wrench it out of their hands. They struggled, but Michael couldn't get a hold of the gun, and they wrestled together out the front door, and then the killer fired. Michael fell backwards onto the patio, dead. At this point, the killer looked up and down North Sparkman Boulevard to make sure nobody was around, and when they were sure they were good, they took off running into the warm summer night. It would turn out all of Jimenez's suspects, Joseph Keyes, David Wynn, Justin Goodwin, and Amber Trudell, did have alibis for Friday, September 26th, between 2 and 3 a.m., which was when the police thought Michael had been murdered. But law enforcement was wrong about Michael's time of death. The heat had fooled them. Michael was not shot to death early on Friday morning, September 26th. He was shot to death early on Thursday morning, September 25th. His body was warm when Detective Jimenez reached down to touch his skin because it had been very hot and muggy outside the whole time he was lying there. The coroner thought the body temperature, combined with the flexibility of the body, meant that death had been recent and that rigor mortis had not begun. But in reality, a hot and moist environment can cause rigor mortis to happen more quickly after death and last for a shorter period of time. So in reality, Michael's rigor mortis had already come and gone by the time Jimenez touched his body, and so the reason he was sort of flaccid feeling is because he no longer was in rigor mortis. And so when the coroner had gone back over the evidence at Detective Jimenez's request, he found something he had missed. Michael's body had larvae in its eyes, which was an indication that he had been dead for a lot longer than a few hours. And when police went back to the crime scene, they realized that the compressor the neighbor had heard on Thursday, which caused them to think that Michael was alive and well and working in a shop that day, was actually set to refill automatically. So that noise had not meant anything at all. It did not mean that Michael was in there at work. And so the adjustment of the time of death from Friday to Thursday morning allowed Jimenez to make sense of that final phone call he got from the person he had already spoken to, who called him asking to meet. That person was Justin's stepfather, the retired police officer. The stepfather had been telling the truth about the timing of Justin and Amber's visit, and that had ruled them out as suspects when the belief was Michael had been killed on Friday. But after he had gotten off the phone with Jimenez, the stepfather had followed a hunch out to the back of his property where he discovered a hole in the dirt. And inside that hole was the murder weapon. But the person who hid that gun was not Justin. It was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Amber Trudell. On Friday, October 10th, an arrest warrant and a nationwide alert was issued for Amber, who had fled Tucson. U.S. Marshals arrested Amber at her grandmother's house in New York. During her trial in March of 2005, Amber claimed that Michael sexually assaulted her on the night he was killed, and that he himself was actually the one who pulled the trigger during their struggle, which resulted in him being shot and killed. However, she was still convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On October 19, 2016, Amber was released from prison, having served out her entire sentence. On September 12, 1982, two off-duty Alaska police officers were off hunting in a very remote section of Alaska about 20 miles away from Anchorage. The only way to get out to this area was by plane or by boat, and so generally speaking, the only people that came into this area were big-time hunters. After a long day, the two men realized it was starting to get dark and they were still deep in the woods, and so they decided it was time to turn around and start heading back to camp. The journey through the woods was challenging, and so the men walked down to the nearby Kinnick River and walked across an exposed sandbar. And as they walked, they noticed up ahead there was a boot sticking out of the sand. And as they got closer, they realized it wasn't just a boot, there was also a human leg bone still in the boot. Being police officers, they knew the importance of not disturbing a potential crime scene, and so instead they marked on the map where they were, they left the area, and they reported the body to their department. The following day, crime scene technicians came out to that remote area, and they very carefully unearthed the remains, which still had women's clothing on them, and then afterwards they began searching for evidence in the area, and eventually they discovered a single shell casing that was a .223 caliber round, which is a common caliber for hunting rifles. The remains were sent back to the lab for an autopsy, and it was revealed this person was a female and she had most likely died at least 6 months earlier. And she had almost certainly been the victim of a homicide because she had died from 3 gunshot wounds. Also during the autopsy, it was discovered that there were no bullet holes on any of her clothing, and so it appeared that she had been shot without her clothes on, and then her killer presumably redressed her. Also, they found a hospital bandage wrapped up in her clothing that appeared to have been wrapped around her head, leading some to speculate that she had been blindfolded before she was shot. A couple of weeks after the autopsy, dental records came back and they identified the body as belonging to 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. Sherry was an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been reported missing 10 months earlier. In her missing persons report, it was stated that the last thing she told her friends was she had been offered $300 to have pictures taken of her by a professional photographer, and she was going to meet this man right before she disappeared. While police were fairly certain that Sherry's killer was this so-called photographer, they had no evidence that would allow them to search for this person. They had nothing. All they had was this shell casing that was commonly used amongst hunters. And there's lots of hunters in Alaska. So the police reported the finding of Sherry's body to the media in hopes that when they put that out to the world, that someone from the public would reach out with more information. During the police's press conference, one of the reporters asked them, do you think Sherry's death is connected to the other unsolved deaths in that part of Alaska? What they were referencing was 2 years earlier, 2 other women's bodies had been discovered in that rough area where Sherry had been found. One of the women was so badly decomposed there was no way to identify her. However, it was revealed she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. The other woman was able to be identified. It was 24-year-old Joanne Messina, who was an exotic dancer from Anchorage. But there was virtually no evidence at either of the 2 women's grave sites, and so their deaths remained a mystery. Publicly, at this press conference, the police told reporters that they did not believe Sherry's death was connected to those 2 other women. But privately, some officers had their suspicions. Not only had these 3 women met similar fates in a similar area, but over the past couple of years, there had been a significant increase in missing people out of Anchorage, Alaska. And most of these missing people were young women that were either exotic dancers or prostitutes. This convinced many officers that they were dealing with a serial killer, but there just wasn't any evidence to actually prove it, so they couldn't come out and say it publicly. Over the following year, no new information came out about Sherry Morrow or the other 2 deceased women that had been found in that same area, and so all 3 of their cases just continued to languish. Meanwhile, more and more exotic dancers and prostitutes were going missing out of Anchorage, and no one knew why. Then, on June 13th, 1983, the police got a break. Early that morning, a man driving a truck turned onto a quiet Anchorage highway, and as he was making his way down the road, he saw up ahead on the side, there was this woman running towards him, screaming with her hands over her head, and she wasn't wearing pants or shoes. And so obviously he knew something was wrong, and so he pulled over, and as this woman is charging up towards him, he notices she has a handcuff on one of her wrists, and she appears to be a lot younger than he initially thought. She's probably in her late teens. And so she comes running up to his car, he unlocks the passenger side door, she flings herself inside without even asking for permission, she slams the door behind her and then ducks down to keep her head out of the window like she's trying to hide from something out there. Now, this man looked out and he didn't see anyone or anything, but he wasn't going to wait around for whatever it was she was scared of. And so he just made a gut decision to take this girl away from here. And so he peeled off and drove down the road. And the girl, who was very shaken up, couldn't even tell this guy what was going on. She just asked him to please drop her off at a nearby motel. And the man didn't ask any questions. He drove her to the motel and he dropped her off. The girl ran inside and up to her room, and when she ran inside, the motel receptionist sees this girl running in. I mean, she doesn't have her pants on, she's got a handcuff on, she looks terrified, and so she called the police. A few minutes later, the police showed up. They went up to this girl's room, they knocked on the door, the girl opened it up, and she was obviously very scared, and she allowed the police inside, and she told them her name was Cindy Paulson, and she was 17 years old. The police recognized this girl is terrified, she's not a threat, and so they removed the one handcuff that was still on her, and then they asked her, what happened? And the police officers would say her story was just horrible. But what stood out to them was not how disturbing the story was, it was how composed and brave this girl was as she told it. This is her story. The night before, Cindy was working the streets of Anchorage. She was a prostitute, and a car pulled up, and inside was this wiry, bearded guy with glasses who seemed kind of slight and harmless, and he asked to buy her services. And because she didn't view him as a threat, she agreed and hopped in his passenger seat, and as soon as she sat down, he reached over and put a handcuff on one wrist and then drew a gun on her and told her to be quiet. And then he drove her to this fairly nice neighborhood, pulled into a driveway. He got her out of the car and led her into this house, and he brought her along downstairs into the basement, where as soon as she got down there was a dim light, and she saw there was a chain swinging from the ceiling. And he strung her up onto that chain, and for hours he assaulted her. And then after he grew tired of doing that, he told her he was going to go take a nap, and when he came back, they were going to leave this house and go out to his cabin in the woods. At this point, she begged him to let her go, but he really didn't care. He just told her that if she made any noise or tried to escape at any point, he would have to kill her. And then he walked out of the room. And for the next several hours, Cindy remained chained to the ceiling with half of her clothes off, wondering what horrible thing was going to happen to her next. Eventually, her attacker came back in the room and he untied her from her chain and he walked her upstairs to his living room where he very proudly showed her a number of hunting trophies he had, and he began telling her about how much he loved hunting and where he went hunting. And it was at this point that Cindy realized this guy has no intention of keeping her alive. He's shown her his face, his house, his car. He's told her about places he likes to go and things he likes to do. He's given her all this information about himself. She is a huge liability to him. And so it dawned on her that if she didn't find a way to escape, she was going to die. After the trophy tour, the man led Cindy back out to her car, he put her inside, and then he drove to a nearby small airport where he said his plane was. And so he pulled over to their hangar, he got her out of the car, and he put her inside of the plane. And as Cindy is sitting in the plane, she's watching this guy load gun after gun and bag after bag of what looks like military supplies into this plane. And so she knows that this is the moment. I have to escape right now because as soon as this plane takes off, I'm done for. And so at some point when this guy went over to his car to get something and his back was turned to her, she jumped out of the cockpit of this plane, she fell to the ground, she got up and just began running out of the hangar. And she managed to get out of the hangar and began turning the corner and running towards this forest right as she hears this guy charging after her, screaming that he's going to catch her and kill her. And so she just keeps running for her life all the way into this forest, all the way to that highway before she finally stopped and turned around and she saw the man had stopped following her. This is when she went onto the highway and she flagged down the guy in the truck who brought her to the motel. The police were shocked by her story. It sounded totally unbelievable, but she was so genuinely scared and so detailed that they believed her. And so they told her they would have to bring her to the hospital, and on their way to the hospital, she demanded they go back to that airport that she had been held at so she can try to identify the hangar she had been in, and hopefully the plane would still be in there. And so the police comply, they go into the airport, and Cindy points out the hangar she believes she was in. And when they get there, the plane she had been on was still there, but the man, her attacker, was not there. And so the police got out and they began taking down notes about the plane, its different tag numbers and what it looked like. And while they're standing there, the security guard from the airport came over because he saw the police cars, and he told the officers that the night before he had seen the owner of the plane they're looking at acting very suspiciously with something inside of his car. And so on a hunch, he had recorded that man's license plate number and he gave that number to police. And so the police were able to use that license plate number and some of the numbers on the plane to figure out who owned both vehicles. And it was a local man named Robert Hansen who owned a very successful bakery downtown. After dropping Cindy off at the hospital, the police officers decided to pay a visit to Robert Hansen at his house. When they got there, Robert was actually pulling into his driveway right at the same time, and they saw his car matched the description that Cindy had given of his car. And then when Robert got out of his car, he matched the description that Cindy had given of her attacker. When Robert saw the police parked outside of his house, he immediately invited them over and said, what can I help you with? And the police said, we'd like to talk to you. Can we go inside? Robert invited them inside, and when the police went into his house, it matched the description that Cindy had given of his house with all the hunting trophies everywhere. And so they sat down and they asked him what he was doing the night before, and he said he had spent the night with some friends and he had their contact information, and if you needed to talk to them you could, but they would say he was with them. When the police asked if they could have a look around his property, Robert immediately consented and said you can look anywhere you want. And so the police searched his property but found no signs that Cindy had been attacked there. And so they thanked him for his hospitality and they left. Once they got back to their station, they checked in with Robert's two friends he claimed he was with the night before, and they each independently corroborated Robert's story, saying that yes, he was with them from this time to this time. And so it appeared, as unlikely as it seemed, that Robert was telling the truth. And so the police went back to Cindy and they said, are you sure that everything you told us is exactly as you remember it? You didn't exaggerate anything? This is the truth? And Cindy said, absolutely. And they said, okay, well, are you prepared to take a lie detector test to prove that you're telling the truth? And Cindy said, no. Now, it's unclear why she said no. Maybe it was a general distrust of the police, but either way, when she said no, it immediately cast an enormous amount of doubt on her story in the eyes of the police. And when Cindy started to pick up that the police really didn't believe her anymore, she got spooked and just left town. And after that, her case and Robert Hansen were largely forgotten about. But 3 months later, on September 2nd, all of that changed. On that day, a construction crew was doing some work on a backcountry road not far from where those 3 women's bodies had been found. And at some point, one of their machines uncovered some human remains. The police were called in, who pulled up the rest of the remains, and then just like in Sherry Morrow's case, when they looked for evidence around this new body, they found a single shell casing from a .223 caliber round. The remains were brought back for an autopsy, where it was determined that the body was female and she had died from several gunshot wounds. Using dental records, they were able to identify this woman as being 17-year-old Paula Goulding, who was an exotic dancer who had gone missing 5 months prior from Anchorage. The police sent the .223 shell casing found in Paula's gravesite, along with the other .223 shell casing found in Sherry Morrow's gravesite, to a lab to be analyzed. And it was quickly determined that both of these rounds had been fired from the same rifle, and therefore both women had most likely been killed by the same person. This was the moment the police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, and many police officers wanted it to be Robert Hansen. He seemed like the guy, but he had a rock-solid alibi and they had no hard evidence against him. And so without any other suspects, the police turned to a famous FBI profiler, a guy by the name of John Douglas, and they asked him to build a profile of who he think killed Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. And when John's report came back, the police were shocked. The profile described a man in his 40s who blended in easily with society. He was well-liked and got along with people and was just a normal guy. And he was successful, probably because he owned a successful business. He was an avid outdoorsman and hunter, and he most likely had a significant speech defect, like a lisp or a stutter. The profile was perfectly describing Robert Hansen. And because of John Douglas's prolific success in correctly identifying killers based on his profiles, when a judge saw this particular profile and saw how neatly it lined up with Robert Hansen, he gave the FBI a search warrant for Robert's house. And this time, they would find very damning evidence, like a map of the local area. It was a hunting map, and on it, there were 37 X's marked off. And some of those X's coincided with the same area where those 4 women's bodies had been found. They also found a .223 caliber rifle, along with a bag of women's jewelry that contained a necklace belonging to Sherry Morrow. As the FBI was carrying evidence out of Robert's house into their truck, a neighbor walked over after seeing all the commotion, and she walked up to one of the agents, and she was very skittish and anxious, and she said, my husband, he's friends with Robert, and he recently pretended to be an alibi for Robert. He had no idea how much trouble he was in, and I certainly didn't know, but I want you guys to know that my husband was lying. He was not with Robert on the night that he said he was. And this was the proverbial nail in the coffin for Robert Hansen, because now, without this alibi, he had nothing to hide behind. And so when the police approached Robert with their overwhelming evidence against him between what they found in his house and this now recanted statement from his former alibi, Robert said, okay, I'm going to confess. But there was a catch. He was only willing to confess to murdering the 4 women whose bodies had already been found by police. Now, the police knew Robert had almost definitely killed more people, and so at this point, they just wanted to know who the other victims were and where they were. And so they offered Robert a deal where he would confess to those 4 murders and then give additional information about other victims, where they were located, who they were, what happened to them. In exchange, they would not prosecute him on any other victims he named. And so Robert agreed to these terms, he signed the deal, and then he gave a full, horrifying confession. He said he would drive around Anchorage at night and look for young, vulnerable women that were all alone. These were usually prostitutes out on the street, or they were exotic dancers he would try to befriend inside of clubs. And when he approached these women, he would tell them he was a professional photographer and he thought they were beautiful and he wanted to take photos of them, and he would pay them for the photo shoot. And many of these women were aspiring models and they were really excited at this idea, and so they would agree to go. And so Robert would tell them to meet him the next day at a particular location, which was usually a fast food restaurant. And Robert would show up much earlier and he would hide in his car and he would wait to see when they showed up if they were alone or not. And when he saw they were alone and they had no one to help them, he would drive up and he would ask them to get in his car. What these women couldn't see was on the inside of the passenger side door was a handcuff that was already latched on to the door itself, and there was an open cuff waiting for them as soon as they got in. They would get in the car, he would reach over them and act like he was helping them put on their seatbelt, and then as they're kind of looking at him, wondering what he's doing, he would grab their wrist, throw it in the open handcuff, then he would draw a pistol and hold it against their head and say, "Be quiet." During his confession, Robert bragged to police that he had done this so many times, putting the handcuff on and drawing the pistol, that it was like muscle memory for him. Once he had the women handcuffed inside of his car, he would drive them back to his house and he would bring them into his basement and he would chain them up to the ceiling just like Cindy had described. And then after assaulting them for hours, he would take them out of his basement, put them in his car, drive out to the airport, He would put them in his plane, but unlike Cindy, these women didn't escape, and he would take off and he would fly them out to his cabin, which was not far from where those 4 bodies had been found. Once he got the women into his cabin, he would undress them and put a blindfold on them, and then with their handcuffs still on, he would assist them out the front door and tell them to run. And they would. They would take off as fast as they could into the woods, running into trees, falling over, but just running for their lives, believing their ordeal was now over. They just had to get away from this guy. But what they didn't know is their ordeal was just starting. Robert had no intention of allowing them to escape. He knew there was deep water that surrounded his cabin, and so if they actually made it that far to the water's edge, they would drown. And so Robert would give these women a significant head start to give them the sense that they actually might escape. And then Robert would grab his knife and his hunting rifle, and he would head out and begin stalking his prey. And for the next several hours or days, he would walk around the woods looking for these women, and he would just stay off, watching what they were doing. And at some point, he would sneak up on them and he would wound them intentionally, usually with his knife, and then he had a blood trail to follow. And he would follow these dying women who were screaming out for help. And at some point, these women would know they were going to die. There was no hope for them, and they would collapse or they would stop. And at that point, Robert would walk up to them and he would shoot them. Afterwards, he would remove their handcuffs, he would redress them, and then he would bury them in a shallow grave. Before he was carted off to prison to serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole, he was brought out by authorities to help identify where other grave sites were in that hunting area. But he was only able to find 8 additional victims because he would go to different grave sites and the remains would not be there anymore, most likely because animals had ransacked the area, or he just simply forgot where it was, or he didn't want to share any more information with police. Robert never confirmed if all 37 of those X's on that map that was found are actual sites of victims that he buried. But investigators say that's exactly what they were, and in fact, many believe there are other maps with more X's on them. But the police could only confirm 17 victims. If there were more, we probably will never know, because in 2014, Robert died in prison and he took those.
Listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast, if you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please secretly teach the 5-star review button's pet parrot to scream obscenities every time the 5-star review button is on a work call. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all of them